U.S. Vice President and Democratic Party's presidential nominee Kamala Harris sat down for a joint interview with her running mate Tim Walz on CNN just a few hours ago, and she emphasized that her values have not changed when asked about her changing position on fracking and immigration. But the paramount question right now is that was Harris able to pose herself as a strong leader? To talk more on this and to discuss the key highlights of Harris's interview, which comes between last week's DNC in Chicago and the presidential debate between Trump and Harris set to take place on September 10th. We're now being joined by Mr. Stephen Golub, political analyst and lawyer, and he's joining us live from California. Thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Life Conversation, Mr. Golub.
Good to be here.
Now, Mr. Golub, how do you assess the Harris-Walz sit-down interview? From immigration and fracking to the economy, Harris outlined her policies on all these issues. But do you think that she was able to connect with the undecided voters and perhaps pose herself as a pragmatic leader?
Well, just as a very brief preliminary point, I think some of the questions could have been better. These questions about fracking and immigration are legitimate, but there are big issues out there that weren't asked about. China, women's rights in the U.S., the future of democracy in the U.S., the possibility of an Israeli-Iran war. Instead, some of the questions were kind of small bore, I should say, in terms of fracking, for example. Did she change her position from 5 years ago? Now, to more directly answer your question, I think if I had to grade her, I'd give her a B, on the scale of A, B, C, D, in that I think she played it safe. That was her intent. She was kind of vague in some of her answers, particularly in her first answer when she was asked, what will you do on day one? She just talked in bromides in terms of, well, I'm going to do things for the middle class of America, rather than getting into specifics that might have been more powerful and persuasive. But having said that, she did play it safe. As I said, that was her intent, and that probably suited her in terms of the interview not hurting her, not coming away with a gotcha line that could be used very powerfully against her, and reassuring people that she's a moderate personality, a moderate politician.
Right, Mr. Golub, so, I mean, even during the DNC, she played it really safe. She spoke about her upbringing and the Indian root touch that she has. However, she also touched upon few policies, debarring economy and immigration. But even today, like you mentioned, that she played it quite safe. But the paramount question amongst the Americans right now is that okay, they know about Harris's policies, but she hasn't really touched upon how she would want to enact them once she becomes the president of the United States of America.
Well, I suggest she's getting into specifics to some extent. She has some specific proposals regarding tax relief for the middle class, and she's emphasizing the middle class. But I agree, she's not getting heavily into specifics. Bill Clinton, our former president, he'd have a list of, I'm going to do A, B, C, D about this given problem, quickly rattling off policies or steps he's going to take. That's not her approach. But it kind of makes political sense, given what a short campaign is. She wants to put out a general image for herself. And as long as that image is associated with certain general political tendencies, tacking towards the middle, not going far to the left, that may very well be a smart approach to take. She has some very smart people advising her, the veterans of the successful Obama campaigns. So those generalities, I agree, that's what she's tending towards, but they probably makes political sense, particularly since Donald Trump kind of speaks in all sorts of generalities, and he's often hard to understand. It's often hard to understand what he's even getting at, given the way he speaks.
Right, Mr. Golub, Harris wasn't alone. She was accompanied by running mate Tim Walz. Do you think that the duo together perhaps position themselves as a team that the Americans would want to see in the White House?
Oh, yeah. I really think I had doubts about her initially picking Tim Walz because I didn't know very much about him. Most Americans didn't. He hadn't been a leading contender for president or for the nomination until very late in the game. But part of her campaign, and again, this just gets back to the notion of generalities, is to show that it's a joyous, cheerful, positive campaign. And I think that makes sense for her. And Tim Walz compliments her perfectly in that regard, as well as bringing some Midwestern down-to-earthness, if that's a term, and credibility to, frankly, a woman who, for all of her strengths, some people in Middle America might have doubts about by virtue of being Asian and Black and a woman. So he's a great compliment to her. And I think they have a good rapport in all sorts of settings, including even in that interview.
Right, Mr. Golub, now we've seen that both the camps, Democratic and Republican camps, they both have intensified their campaign going forward, and we've seen Trump's concerted effort in questioning Harris's racial identity. But during that sit-down interview with CNN, Harris clearly said that it's the same old tired playbook. How do you assess Harris, or perhaps the Democratic camp's outlook towards Trump's rhetoric? Do you think they're trying to not give too much importance to what Trump is saying or targeting Harris, but more or so broadly on the policies of their camp?
Yes, I think, and I do believe they're playing it smart in that regard. Look, there are respects in which I, as I said, wish she were more specific and in her answers during this interview. But when it comes to something like Trump insulting her by saying, well, one day she's Asian, one day she's Indian, one day she's Black, she's smart not to get into the pigsty with him, not to get into wrestling in the mud with him, but simply to dismiss him and to all kind of demean him in the process of dismissing him. So it's smart not to go back and forth with Trump on all the dirt and insults that he hurls, because it doesn't necessarily do her any good. Better, at least in some respects, such as this, to be above the fray, to appear above the fray, to appear to be the better, calmer, wiser person, and to be, frankly, more presidential.
Talking about Trump, Mr. Golub, how do you think the Republican camp will be looking at this joint interview? Because latest polls suggest that Harris has clearly surpassed Trump in few of the polls, with around 43% for Trump and 48% for Harris, so with a margin of around 5%.
Well, I think, look, they'll find something in this interview to jump on, to use in their ads, to use in social media against her, no matter what she would say. So they'll find things along the lines of this question that you mentioned and that Dana Bash from CNN raised about her changing her positions. They'll accuse her of flip-flopping. But as I indicated, there wasn't any real gotcha moment that will come back to haunt her in ways that could be tremendously politically damaging. And that was part of her intent, to avoid that kind of damage. More generally, in terms of the polls, I'm speculating a bit here now, but the key polls are really not the national polls of her up, as you said, 48 to 43 in one of them, but the 7 or so swing states, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, several others. That's the key polling data to look at going forward. And she is edging ahead of him in those states, but not as much as the 48 to 43 margin indicates. And if I may, one more point briefly about the polling data is that it is looking good for her, but we have to remember that in both 2016 and 2020, Donald Trump outperformed the polls and did better to the point of winning against Hillary Clinton, and did better than the polls had indicated right before the election in terms of coming close to beating Joe Biden. So we have to take the polls with a grain of salt in that regard.
Right, Mr. Golub, thank you so much for joining us on Beyond Life Conversation with your insights. Always a pleasure to have you here.
My pleasure as well. Thank you.